Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Gibb. I run accountsrecovery.net, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on how to perform a compliance audit. Audits are part of the cost of doing business for companies in the ARM industry, but doing a proper compliance audit is not always something for which companies are prepared. Today in this webinar, which is being brought to you by TCN, we have a panel of compliance experts here to share their policies and procedures for how to properly conduct a compliance audit. Before introducing the panel, I did want to make my usual customary spiel about the accountsrecovery.net Slack channel. I just put a link in the chat window to join if you haven't already done so. Not sure what you're waiting for. We've got about 550 people who are part of the channel right now, using it to exchange information with one another, stay in touch with one another, network with one another. It's a great way to, for all of that. So if you haven't done so, I encourage you to click on the link and join today. It's completely free, doesn't cost you anything. And you can get in. We're voting in the final of our Logo Madness tournament to determine which company in the ARM industry has the best logo. So if you haven't done that already, I encourage you to do so today. Now, let me introduce you to today's panelists. Roseanne Anderson serves as Ontario Systems Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer. She's a licensed attorney and 30-year veteran and advocate of the banking, credit, and collections industry. She holds Chief Compliance Officer certifications from both ACA International and RMAI. In 2020, she received the Women in Compliance International Award as Compliance Officer of the Year. Prior to joining Ontario Systems, Roseanne served as former General Counsel, Director of Government Affairs, and CEO of ACA International. Since 2011, she has led Ontario Systems regulatory compliance efforts to ensure compliance solutions are embedded in the company's software, contact management, payment processing, and cloud solutions. Vaishali Rao focuses her practice in consumer financial services with particular emphasis on regulation and compliance. She regularly counsels student loan lenders, servicers, and debt collectors in risk management, including compliance with state servicing laws and seeking regulatory opinions from government entities. Prior to joining Hinshaw and Culbertson, she spent 8 years in her practice devoted to public service in the Consumer Fraud Bureau of the Office of the Illinois Attorney General and is an assistant counsel to Speaker Michael J. Madison in the Illinois House of Representatives. As the owner and president of ARM Compliance Business Solutions, Sarah Wagerman works with organizations to drive compliant business practices through her consulting solutions. Her personalized approach prepares financial institutions for regulatory examinations, manage litigation risk, and improve the consumer experience. Sarah is known for her passion in helping companies overcome their unique compliance and operational challenges through delivery of compliance risk assessments, policy development, service provider management and oversight, and executive level training programs designed to help financial services companies mitigate risk and maximize efficiency. Our format for our webinar is going to be a panel discussion. We encourage everybody to submit questions and we'll get to them during the course of our conversation today. To submit a question, please either do so via the Q&A tab on your Zoom webinar control panel, or you can send it in through the chat window. Since our panel is probably going to be talking about compliance today, let me read the following disclaimer. This presentation is not intended to be legal advice and may not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to ensure this information is up to date. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area. It should never be used to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. All right, now that I've said that and gotten all that out of the way, I can bring in our panel for what everyone here is here for today, and that's for their insight and perspective. So let's talk about first, we're talking about compliance audits today. So I'm going to make my first question a really hard one and ask, what is a compliance audit? And let's see, Sarah, you signed on last, so I'm going to let you go first.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a really good question because everyone's compliance management system should actually have three very specific controls that are doing look backs, right? So the first would be monitoring. That's your observations of your day-to-day activities. And your audit program actually tests your company's compliance with your policies and procedures and and testing it back to federal laws and state laws, right? So this is going to be things like FDCPA audits, data furnisher update audits, service provider audits, things like that. And the other element that we're not going to touch on today is really risk assessments, right? So that's a really great question to start off with, Mike. And I always like to there's a lot of confusion and overlap that sometimes happens between monitoring, auditing, and what a risk assessment is. So hopefully that helps.
It does. Thank you. Vaishali, Roseanne, anything else you want to add on top of, that definition of what a compliance audit is, or maybe expand it and to talk about why they matter for collection agencies?
Vaishali, would you care to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it seems kind of like a hard topic to unpack when you first get into it, because it seems overwhelming with all the different features and components of your business operation. But I think in terms of, I mean, it is your first line of defense in terms of staying out of trouble, particularly with regulators. I think everyone's familiar with the CFPB and with the state regulators, and we know for a fact it's going to be a very active CFPB, and probably active on state side too, both state banking regulators and state attorneys general. And so when you think about what are the ways in which, when you see enforcement actions come out, and you think about how did a company get there, and there's often a long road before you get to enforcement, and you see the release of a settlement or litigation. There's often usually several years that go on behind the scenes between the company and the government entity. And one of the critical pieces is just sort of where did the compliance management system potentially fail. And I'm not suggesting everything that's alleged in a government action is accurate, but just in terms of being introspective and looking at it from compliance side, sometimes you can catch those things in audits, and the quicker you catch it, it sort of goes without saying, but it significantly reduces your potential exposure in an action like that. Because even if you did have a sort of a slip up, or you did have some things that didn't go well, you are shortening by catching it and then putting into place a corrective action plan. You're really significantly shortening the amount of exposure you're going to have, because regulators really do, especially regulators like the CFPB, they will add up each potential violation you might have had, or they will use proxies for population pools that might have been affected. So again, no one's business is going to be perfect. There are absolutely going to be things that don't go particularly well or that need improvement, but the idea is to try to catch them early and then put into place some plans to mitigate that risk. And I think that's really the most important reason to perform compliance audits and assessments, and and to really try to get ahead of the curve. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Thank you. I'll offer us this practical example of the perspectives both Sarah and Vaishali are suggesting. If I had a collection agency, I wanted to conduct an audit, I would identify all of my policies and procedures and have either an internal or an external person see, am I actually following those policies and procedures? But let's just say you failed to have, you report items to a credit reporting agency. And let's just say you have no policy on how to establish the date of delinquency, none whatsoever. So that means if I look at your pile, your stack of policies and procedures, I'm not going to find one on how to establish the date of delinquency. Yet you could pass an audit with flying colors. Because if you are auditing to the existing policies and procedures you have, you can get a 100% if you know what I mean. So if you don't have the policy, that's the problem. And that's where a compliance gap assessment comes in. Because where a lot of issues lie is in that void where you do not have a policy and procedure about text frequency, call frequency, now call attempts. You have nothing. And that means you have a gap, and you will never know. In other words, that's part and parcel of how to properly run your organization. So the way I look at it, you need a compliance management system, you need policies and procedures, you need a change management policy other than someone just yelling out, hey, stop that letter, use this one. I mean, that's not a change management policy, that's just a change. A change management program is where you really have something set up so that if you're going to change a letter or a calling practice or credit reporting practice, you actually have documentation of who's approving it, what it is, et cetera. And then ultimately you audit. Are you complying with your policies and procedures?
Okay, there's a lot to kind of go through here. So we're going to spend the next little bit sort of digging into some of these different areas. I just sort of kind of continuing along with establishing the baseline or framework for our conversation today. How often should companies be doing these kinds of audits or assessments? And we've talked about sort of them being done by internal or external people. Is there an ideal scenario that you can draw up for how an agency should be approaching who should be doing these audits?
I'll go ahead and start with that one. I think that you can absolutely have an internal audit department. The key to your auditing function, though, is that it is truly independent from operations. So if your auditing folks are reporting to the chief operating officer, there's a conflict there, right? They truly need to have some independence in their audit function, and to be able to give that really honest feedback in their audit results, and so that they don't get, they just truly need to be independent from operations. That's what I'll say about that. And then how frequently you should do them, it depends on the type of audit. Often when I'm advising clients, I say, okay, we actually look to the risk assessments. What's a high risk item here that we might want to audit more frequently? Some audits may be done monthly, some might be done weekly, some might be done quarterly, and some might be annually, depending on the risk threshold. So that's what I'll say about that.
Go ahead.
No problem.
Yes, you can
Yeah, sure. I think the things I would add to what Sarah mentioned, which all make complete sense, would be a couple things. One is, I think often in smaller collections operations, it feels like you're always playing catch up because you have client audits that are going on all the time. And then you have potentially your own schedule of audits that are happening routinely. And so one of the things that sometimes gets lost a little bit there is then taking the step back and figuring out from the risk assessment, like Sarah mentioned, what things you might want to increase and enhance in terms of the audit function, because you're kind of really, like I said, just trying to play catch up. You're really trying to just make it. And it's really difficult to take that breather, but it's really important because you may just be continuously trying to fix those things that come out of audit reports, especially, a client will say, hey, you need to button down this specific issue. And then you're going and fixing that one specific issue. And then something else is popping up and it feels a little whack-a-mole. So to that end, I would really suggest that the heads of organizations are sitting down with when I say heads, I mean CEO level, are sitting down with their internal audit function, as Sarah mentioned, potentially separate from an operations discussion, and really going through nitty gritty what it is you're finding on a big picture level, at least quarterly. And also, I can't say enough to document those types of meetings. Again, something that I think smaller organizations struggle with is being able to show that those types of conversations and discussions have been had. And they're really important when you get into, for example, supervision. When you're in an examination with either the CFPB or with the states, they will want to know, did you understand the macro issues? Did you understand the big picture at CEO level? And then how did your audit function respond and tweak your audit functions? How did you make adjustments and how were you flexible in responding to the issues that came up? So I just add those two things, taking a step back and trying to assess the big picture and having regularly scheduled meetings and having documentation of those meetings. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Yeah, I think those are great responses. The one I always like to go, it's almost unfair to get to be the last person in the, because I can kind of, do some fill in here, but because what I was saying is I don't know exactly who's listening to this particular webinar, but if you are talking about large agencies that have a legal department and a very, fully staffed compliance department, et cetera, the answer about how frequently you may do something may be a little bit different than if you were a 10-person collection agency. I'm sure if you have a 10-person collection agency, you're probably one. I can't audit myself every week, for heaven's sakes. I won't even have a business. You won't have any time left. So one thing I like to say is that establishing a regular routine for an internal audit is, I would say, a minimum of a year, a minimum. And then your compliance gap assessment should also take place maybe at the semi-annual point, so that you know that you're actually establishing policies and procedures for the type of business you are in. So how does this, to give you a clear example would be, let's say you're a healthcare collection agency, and you have been for the history of your organization, but all of a sudden now you're taking on telecom, or maybe you've grown and you're taking on a credit card company. Well, your business needs will drive changes to your compliance management system because of the new line of business you are in. So you will need to constantly be in touch with whoever, whether it's an in-house compliance person or an outside compliance person. When you take on new business, you might as well just consider it an opportunity to make sure, do we need new policies and procedures around that line of business? That's very, very important, because that's where people miss opportunities, I guess, to build the right procedures around the business function.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Roseanne said. I just want to piggyback one thing. If you add business types, absolutely. Also, how about implementing new technology? How about, if suddenly you want to now, implement a text messaging program, you should probably have really strong audit controls around that initially. And you may back off of that. You might say, okay, you know what? We feel fairly confident that everything is working as intended. There's no unintentional, systemic issues or, things coming out of this. We're not getting complaints. So maybe I back this off to monthly, and then maybe you back it up to quarterly. Typically, I suggest things like ramp up auditing at first and then determine your regular cadence after that, especially as you implement anything new. Yeah. Okay.
Excellent. I just want to hit the pause button on our discussion briefly and say a few words about TCN, the sponsor of today's webinar. TCN provides cost-effective call center solutions for traditional contact centers, collection agencies, and thousands of businesses worldwide. TCN has continually stayed current with TCPA and CAPB changes by introducing enhancements to its core platform, one of which is TCN's natural language compliance, which uses smart algorithms to build compliance rules naturally. Simply type your rule into the TCN Compliance Manager, and the natural language compliance engine will build an easy to understand compliance rule. One example of a rule could be deny outbound calls before 8 a.m. and after 9 p.m. You could even type a rule that would limit 7 calls in 7 days. There's no limit to the number of rules TCN's processing engine can compute. TCN software is a platform suite that also provides built-in data management services that eliminate data entry errors, business intelligence with reporting dashboards, call recording with storage, smart IVR with payment capabilities, speech analysis and transcription, and much more. Regardless of size, location, or application, TCN can provide robust solutions for your call center and collection agency. Give TCN a call today or visit them at www.tcn.com for more information. And I did put a link in the chat window that anyone can click on to visit TCN's website. And thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. There seems to be an interesting juxtaposition as I'm listening to each of you talk, in that compliance audits seem to be there's a subjectivity to it, to how often they should be done, to what you're looking for, but audits themselves aren't really subjective. So I'm wondering, how you kind of manage that dynamic between determining how often something should be done and how to do it with, what the outcomes are supposed to be that you're looking for when you do those audits. And, Vaishali, maybe you can kick us off this time.
Sure. You're right, there is a balance there. I would say though, Roseanne probably hit on the critical piece just in her comment to the last question, which is there is flexibility by organization size and type of work you're doing, but there needs to be some rigor to the schedule, and there needs to be consistency inside of your organization about what it is you're performing. Because if you think about it, I mean, you really cannot just continue to grasp at random concepts, or you will not be able to trend what is happening big picture across your organization. So for sure, you know, one good resource is looking just at the CFPB's supervision manual. They pretty much lay out exactly the topics that they're interested in. Those are not the only topics you should be auditing, but that is probably a good starting place if you're not sure exactly, you know, where to look and how to get started with even the core concepts. But there, I would say too, on that same point, I think about if something's a struggle for your organization to kind of get in the rhythm, think about how you might use some level of technology that's appropriate for your organization to help you, because not everything can be performed by a single person, and a lot of entities have one single internal auditor, if that, or you may be outsourcing it to another entity, and it's difficult to keep up with the constant demands for all the different topics. And so think about what issues that you might have to frequently audit can you use technology to help you pull automated reports on. And I think that will really help you. Again, it's I know all organizations are different in size and scope, and so certainly not suggesting the biggest collections operation can use the same types of technology as the smallest in every instance, but there is probably more than you think out there. And so again, I would say, you know, again, if for example, let's take an easy one in the sense it's one that all collection agencies face: call monitoring. You know, if you are struggling to have, for example, complete compliance in that area, if you're struggling to have your trainings really be effective, and what I mean by that is you're retraining a lot and it's still getting picked up in call monitoring that your collectors are having issues with certain topics. Let's just take one again that's really easy because it's one everybody may have to face, which is, let's say, bad language, right? You're struggling that folks are not able to really get completely compliant as you want them to be with staying on track with the types of language they're using. You can use speech analytics as a tool in order to try to, you know, have a first line of defense. And so I say that I'm kind of a little off topic, but I'm hoping to bring it back home, Mike, which is, you know, let yourself have some assistance that may not be necessarily an individual person in order to kind of fit right size the compliance and audit functions. Roseanne, you want to go next? So you're not
Yeah, I'll go next
ahead.
on this one. And at the end of my comment, you're going to get kind of a strange analogy here, but I think there are really, to answer your question, I think there are only two ways to master or to get your arms around a compliance, the gap assessment as well as the audit. One is internal signs and signals, which would be monitor your complaints, your litigation, your calls, the issues that, you know, people are, your number of requests for verification, that kind of information that is very telling that you are interacting negatively with your external audience. So that's an internal system to use. The other is, this is not an advertisement. There's nothing advertising that I don't mean this in any way, but at some point, especially with the new CFPB that's back in town, I'd say you have to buy some level of an external opinion. And this is where it gets a meaning to help you make sure that you have covered all the required elements of a compliance management system. And then you can ultimately audit against that. The reason I say that is a lot like, because you don't know anymore what is bad or good within your organization. One thing that often happens, I mean, obviously there are some agencies that are extremely progressive and they're just on top of everything. But let's just say you're just a regular person running your collection agency. What happens is you don't even know that what you've been doing for years may not be okay. Like, for example, you credit report, you've always credit reported. People call up and they dispute an item on your credit report and you just delete it. Or they say, how about if I pay you? Will you delete it? You just go, okay. You may not even know any better that that's a huge taboo right now. That's a huge taboo that just draws the attention of regulators. So this is my goofy analogy. I like to cook. My mother taught me that when you're making pasta, put salt in the water and, as it boils, put salt in the water. If I hired a nutritionist slash compliance officer, I bet they would say, quit with the salt in the water. This is, 2021. We have heart attacks. We have issues with salt. Don't add salt to water. And that would be something that I never would have even thought of. So that's kind of the same thing. Our own agency, there may be issues there like salt that you never even realized were bad. And that is the reason that you cannot, I'm not saying you have to have a $100,000 compliance audit every year, but I'm suggesting that at some point, yes, you buy that service and let them give you some baseline as to where you are at, because this is a risk no one can afford in terms of the cost of the regulatory impact of it. You know what I mean? If you do something incorrect. So that's my goofy analogy, but I hope I made the point.
That was great, Roseanne. I'm just going to add a couple of things. I wholeheartedly agree with Roseanne that risk assessment, gap assessment, whatever you want to call it, it's what informs your audit and should also influence your monitoring controls, right? So that, earlier I said, I think your internal audit can completely be done in-house. I think it can. I don't necessarily believe that's true with a risk assessment. And it's because of what Roseanne just said. You're operating with blinders. You're not intentionally operating with blinders, but you are, because you're within your own four walls of your company. And I give a really good example. I see a comment in there, how do you know when to maybe back off the cadence or look at it? So I'm going to give you a real life example before I was a consultant, when I was actually doing this in a company. And we had created what we called our consumer response team. And they were the people who were in charge of responding to complaints and disputes and all of the management and all the timeliness of it. So we established an audit to make sure that those people were doing their job, right? So their boss monitored them, and then we had an independent audit on that team. And here I am, it was a small company too. It wasn't a large company, but every time I went in to do a risk assessment on the audit control of that process, I uncovered something every single time that I was missing. Like, what do you mean mail is being put on so-and-so's desk and it's not being put on the log for us to manage? I mean, it was things that even in a small company that were easily missed. And so we did not back off our auditing. We kept that going. I think we started off weekly because it was super important that all those responses were timely and accurate when they went back to consumers. But at some point, we backed that off to monthly. And the way I determined when to back that off was the number of non-conformities that were being identified, right? So as we fixed things, as we fixed our audit, as we created additional monitoring controls, as we implemented training and said, make sure every piece of mail gets directed here, whatever it is, right? As those non-conformities decreased and everyone really understood that the procedures that were, the newly implemented procedures, that's when I felt comfortable backing off the audit. So I hope that helps with that question that we got in there.
So I guess if I'm understanding correctly, and by all means, feel free to tell me if I'm not, when it comes to sort of frequency, there's, you have a little bit of freedom to sort of set your own schedule, but whatever schedule you set, make sure you can kind of sort of justify it and make sure it's consistent. Do I have that right? Is there anything else I'm missing to that?
Well, there should be a methodology to how you're thinking about like your timing of it, right? So there's an ongoing schedule, so there's always should be some form of auditing happening, right? But you're not doing all audits all the time. But yes, you should keep with the regular cadence. So yeah, you should know. So if a regulator comes in and says, well, why did you determine only to look at calls, once a year, let's just say something crazy like that, right? Why were you only auditing your call monitoring program once a year? Well, you better know why you did that way, because, there could be really good reasons why, but there needs to be a methodology in which you determine that. And you should probably document that in whether it's your compliance committee notes or your board of director notes or, your minutes, whatever, but that should probably be documented when you make those changes somewhere so that you can go back to that.
I was just going to say very quickly, I would at least, but like no less than annually, right?
Yeah.
I can't imagine.
It really depends. Again, your highest risk items should be probably more frequent, right? So anything that's a direct consumer contact should probably be more than annually.
We've talked a little bit about the change, some of the changes that have gone on at the CFPB. Another pending change is the enactment of Regulation F, currently scheduled for November, but possibly being put off until January. How does that, that regulation, that rule, the provisions of it, how does that affect how companies should be addressing audits right now? Should they be looking at including some of those provisions, or should they wait until everything kind of goes into effect and they've actually started making changes? How do you sort of incorporate a huge landmark change like Regulation F into your auditing process? Roseanne, I'm gonna let you go first this time.
Okay, so since you and I know each other so well, I'm going to go like, duh. Yes, these new rules call for a very thorough gap assessment. Now it's already about a month ago, I was at it was the RMAI meeting, and Tom Paul spoke. He was the former assistant director of the CFPB, and he spoke. And I actually, if it's okay with Mike, I'm going to share a link to a blog I wrote about this. He basically said, yes, you have to build a compliance management system that incorporates these new rules for your organization and conduct a gap assessment and audit against them and be prepared for either the November 30th or the January 29th date, whichever it is. They're both coming quickly, even if they grant the extension, and that you should be actually conducting a gap assessment and audit based on the new rules. Now, that is not to say that he said, nor am I suggesting that you should go live with the new rules prior to the compliance date. I am just simply saying that in a test database, in a test space, which any vendor should sell you for not thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars, you can set up your entire system so that you are testing how it will work when you go live. So I would strongly recommend testing and against the compliance requirements long before you have a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, I think even taking a step before that, I know Roseanne would agree, which is you got to get a handle of the legal requirements. And I think it's scary because it feels big, but you have to rip off the Band-Aid. So anyone who's not already ripped off the Band-Aid, do so today. Just start. It's, you can enlist help to do so, but a couple things. One is not everything in Reg F is new. So there is a lot of overlap with either things that were existing in FDCPA or things that were frankly just industry practice. So, that should give you some comfort if you haven't quite gotten there. But I think in good news, because it's Monday today, so let's start the week positively. In good news, it is a chance to do that gap analysis and to really think about the ways in which you're communicating with consumers. Because of course we know Reg F does change call limitations and does open up some possibilities more clearly, at least on text message and email communication. And there are a lot of steps and procedures involved with how you get comfortable with what's okay in that space. And I will tell you, I think, you know, it is a little going to be a little bit more art than science at the beginning, which is, you know, some things like calls have clear limitations, other things like email and text don't. And so there's going to be a comfort level that your organization needs to feel. And another way to put that, there's going to be a level of risk your organization is going to want to take, and it's different for everybody as to what the overlay is between text, emails, and calls. And it's something that I mean, I really believe this. You have to talk with your clients about it. I don't think you're going to be able to make these decisions in a vacuum. And I say all that because that is going to take time to implement in terms of process. And then that is going to take time to develop policy procedure. And then that is going to take time to build on to really incorporate that into a CMS system and then to audit. So we're talking about really, you know, probably a 4 to 5 step process. It's critical you get started right now and at least understand what's in it, and then start thinking about how is your organization going to adapt and how is it going to incorporate some of these opportunities, quite frankly. And then you can get into the cadence of audit and how, but there is going to be an absolute expectation. There should be no mistakes about it from the regulators that you will audit what is in Reg F. So, you know, again, no mistakes about it. Everything in Reg F will be checked in examinations and then some. So get started. Go ahead, Sarah.
No, Vishali, I think you just articulated that perfectly. I mean, I was just going to say, before you can audit, you have to have a policy and a procedure. So you have to make some decisions right now on, you know, what you're going to be implementing, what parts of, you know, how are you going to implement, what technology controls you're going to have, and then build the audit behind it. Now, but this really is a critical time for you to do that risk assessment, gap assessment, to identify where those holes are right now in your auditing program. So that was perfect.
So you do the risk assessment, you understand, you know, you figure out how often you should be doing the audits, you do an audit, and, you know, there's problems. So, you know, let's talk a little bit about what should be done, you know, when errors or issues are found during a compliance audit. You know, what should an agency be doing with these results? You know, do they get shared with clients? Let's spend some time talking about what to do with the results of an audit, other than just sort of fix it. Hopefully it's more than that, because otherwise we're not going to have a lot to talk about. But Sarah, we'll kick us off.
All right, sorry. I was reading Roseanne's comments about her uplifting article from Tom Paul's thing. So can you repeat the question?
Yes,
I was
of course.
smirking.
What do you do?
So sorry.
What do you do with the results of a compliance audit? You do the audit, you find their issues.
Yes.
What do you do with it?
Okay. So once you have the audit, it is very important that you have a reporting structure of where this is going, right? It really needs to go to your executive leadership team. They need to have eyes on that, and they need to understand the non-conformities that you've identified through your risk, through your auditing. Needs to be very, very clear about what needs to happen next. And typically the internal audit team isn't the one who says, you know, we need a final written warning or this person needs to be fired. I don't usually suggest that that's their role, but they should make, there should be a really good reporting structure so that the executive management team and a corrective action process is followed at that point. So what you do not want to happen is that your audit findings go nowhere. Okay, they cannot go to an abyss. They cannot not have a correction action plan attached to it. It's the absolute worst thing that you could have be identified by a regulator, because let me tell you, that is exactly what they look for. So, you know, recommended corrective actions should be part of that audit report. And and action plans need to be followed up on and reported to executive management.
Shelley, do you have any comments?
My comments would be, I was trying to make you not last, Roseanne.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right,
You
can
go, then
next
I'll
as
add
well.
mine. Okay.
No, I'll go next. What I wanted to share is that, and by Shelley, you can maybe better address this.
Sure.
What I wanted to suggest that what Sarah said is it's just absolutely true. You want to take the remedial action that's necessary, which is not to say if you simply don't do a gap assessment or audit to your gap assessment, then you're okay because you have no record of doing anything wrong. That is not an approach. That's like, la, 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 la. That's anything to advance your situation. Regulatory bodies, and that's why I said Vaishali would know perhaps more firsthand, but they tend to appreciate an organization that does work to detect, investigate, and remediate issues, compliance issues, particularly those that harm or have the potential to harm consumers. They like that. They like to see your continuous improvement and how you embrace it. And how you work with it. So I really don't want anything that we say to be fear tactics such that you don't want to do anything, because that's not the message. But another little note to take, I guess, about this is we have seen the following. If you arrange, let's say, with outside counsel, inside counsel, outside advisors, if you hire them to conduct a compliance gap assessment or an audit or both, you can do so through your attorney. This is the part that isn't absolute legal advice. I can't give you legal advice, but I can give you a suggestion. If you'd like to try to protect and place a privilege around the information, at least seek the advice of your own counsel to see if perhaps the information from the outside organization should flow through that lawyer to executive leadership and very specific people. That is a way to at least consider cloaking it or covering some information with the attorney-client privilege. It's not a guarantee, but it is a step in the right direction. Now, who would that protect the information from? It would be consumers who sue you and their counsel. It does not insulate you from anything regarding the CFPB's curiosity. If they want to see something, they will succeed and they will order you to give it to them, even if it's any of these. There's nothing you can do about it. That's why your response is so important.
Okay, so I'd add a few things. Those are great points. One is maybe Mike, we need to do a session on privilege with this because it's a great topic, Roseanne, and you're right. I won't get into it a ton. I think Roseanne hit the topics. I do think there are some ways to even insulate yourself in particular types of proceedings with the CFPB. And I also think folks maybe need some practical advice about how to get an attorney involved without it being really expensive. So, and when that makes sense, because, you do need to be able to move your organization forward. And if you don't have an inside legal counsel and you don't have a general counsel, you still can avail yourself of some of those protections, but you kind of need to know when to trigger them. So, okay, a whole new topic. Mike, we're all signed up here for the topic. So
coming in June.
Yeah. So, but more to the point on sort of what do you do? One thing just to add to the many important things that Sarah and Roseanne said would be that I think let's just use the word that the Bureau would use, which is root cause analysis. So that would mean that with the finding, and you have a potentially, again, a corrective action plan to make sure that issue doesn't occur again. But even more than that, and this is a tough one because I think folks don't often know when they're performing a root cause analysis and when they're not. But when you think you've found the answer, you kind of dig a couple layers deeper than that, because I think a lot of entities stop with, well, yeah, I know why this occurred. It occurred because the collector didn't take the notes properly. And then that's it. And the question is, why didn't the collector take the notes properly? And then you may have to ask one additional question when you find out that answer. Well, the collector wasn't trained properly. Why wasn't the training adequate?
Right.
Oh, well, that collector missed that training. Why did that collector miss the training, and why didn't your system catch the miss? Or what does the slide say on the training? Or when was the frequency of that training given? And you keep going, and you really just try to think of it like kind of, when you're digging, when you're planting your plants, it's springtime. So we'll use that one. Maybe folks did that this weekend. Continue to dig until you really find the root. And so that can be tough. It's also, it feels time consuming and painful a little bit because everyone's busy, but you do need somebody, and often your internal auditor is a great person to do that, or if you're using an external person, another sort of great thing to do. But make sure you're documenting that root cause, because you will get asked what was the root cause, and then you will get asked for how you resolved the root cause, not just the issue that came up. And the second thing I'd add is what I really like is a flag system, because not all issues are made equal, sort of, not all problems are equal. Some problems are really bad and some problems are not that significant. And so, again, issues that come up that, damage consumers' credit reports, issues that come up where you have very clear unfair deceptive trade practice violations, clear FDCPA issues, those are red flag issues because those give you the most exposure in your organization. And there are a whole host of issues that maybe are not those, and that you can flag or color code as sort of lesser on the scale of issues. And what I like to say with that one is, again, when you're, sometimes it's confusing because in internal audit, you are catching, in the audit procedure in general, whether it's internal or external, you are catching violations of policy and procedure. And again, some policies and procedures can be, for example, client specific. A client will want you to potentially, let's just give an example, cut off calls at 4 p.m. for some reason. Well, that is not a legal violation. And so again, have a distinction. I think it's really helpful to have a distinction between violations of policy and procedure that may be internal policies and procedures, or client specific, or things that you just do as a matter of practice, versus ones that are going to be what I would call red flag potential legal violations. Because again, you can separate those. The more that let's just take in an examination setting, the more that you can separate those for examiners, the easier it's going to be for them to not cite you for violations, because they don't actually have a violation of law there. So hopefully that makes sense. Happy to answer follow-ups on that one.
I just have one so far. With respect to, like, you talking about the flags, and does everything that get flagged get a root cause analysis, or is it only really the sort of severe stuff that you need to do one on?
Well, I'd like to comment on that only because I've been living and breathing the root cause analysis process for the past 18 months at our organization. And no, you don't have to have a root cause analysis for everything. But like Vaishali said, if it's a law violation, something could be of tremendous significance if the law violation, it seems like it's kind of minor, but it impacts many, many people, consumers. Or you could have a very significant law violation that doesn't impact that many people, but it's still a very significant law violation that you do not want to see repeated. So there is a reason. That's another topic, RCAs, the root cause analysis process. How to identify the difference between a priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, and what do you do about it? And what kind of follow-up do you have? For example, at our organization, we have priority 1s, 2s, and 3s that support is supposed to handle. We take care of everything. We make the client, put the client in the best position possible. But if that was a priority 1 or a priority 2, that moves into the RCA process. And we do run a root cause analysis process on that because we've deemed it to be so important. If it really wasn't that important, it probably wouldn't have been a P2 or P1. So I think you have to exercise some judgment, but always in our world, it's all about consumer harm or potential consumer harm under any one of a myriad of federal laws or state laws or regs.
I think this is such an important question because when I work with compliance professionals across the industry, it's very easy for compliance folks who look at this all day long to start to sound like Chicken Little. Okay. And so one of the things when I am working with and training compliance folks is that understanding the overall risk to the organization, whether it's the volume of potential accounts that could be affected, the clients it could affect, that root cause analysis, you keep asking questions until you get to the final answer, basically. So no, not every time are you going to do that, but you have to also have some metrics to understand what is the overall risk to the company. And is it because of a class action lawsuit? Is it reputational? Is it with a client? Making sure that your compliance folks have those tools to be able to articulate the risk level up to executive management, I think is really important.
I think someone's asking a question in the chat. Let me just try to.
It's a good question.
Yeah, let me get a start on addressing it and then add in, ladies, if there's anything else. I think the question is how do you reconcile maybe a difference of opinion as to what's a legal violation? Let me start with something simple, and I know it's more complicated. The simple thing is you have liability for potential violations of law. Your clients maybe do, but you are going to be the first one that gets dinged with a legal violation. So if you feel confident it's a legal violation, you need to dig your heels in a little bit. But oftentimes, let's just take a step back, because I understand it's complicated. Those are your clients. You take their direction many, many times. And it's hard to dig in. And so with, understanding the sort of practical impediments to that advice, I just say this. One thing that I think doesn't happen that much, and I said it kind of earlier, there's not that much communication between legal counsel for collectors and legal counsel for creditors. And I often find when you get the folks who are in the know together on the phone, you start to uncover where there really is a difference. And it's usually something very narrow. And I'm not saying all lawyers agree. We definitely don't. We all have perspectives, but you do start to be able to have a productive conversation about why there's a disagreement. And it usually ends up being narrower than you first thought. So it's like some narrower interpretation of how a particular provision of law is applicable in a certain context. And you'll find that there are many other contexts where you may agree that there's no violation and you can proceed. And so I think look for have more conversations. I wouldn't just take a yes, no on that. I would really try to dig in as to why the answer is coming back the way it is. And then if you can't resolve it and you can't find that middle ground, I would suggest to you, again, you have responsibility over your organization. It's your reputation at risk if you get sued. And you do have to analyze what type of risk and how big and small it is. And just remember that I know it feels sometimes like you don't have the power in the relationship, but you do in fact have that responsibility. And then my last thing I tell you, just throw it out there as a legal issue, is you always have an indemnification issue. So you can always say, client, if you want us to take that risk, we need to have some indemnification because we're not totally in agreement that that's an appropriate risk. So, there's a lot of different things you can do in structure that maybe are not commonly thought of.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I used to be the client, and then I, helped clients. So I've been on both sides of this. And I will tell you now, maybe I was just a really easy client to talk to, but I definitely had third-party collection agencies approach me and say, are you sure you want me to do this? Or, or they would make me aware of things that maybe I didn't know with placement files were going out to them. And so I think that you do have to have that communication. And I think it's okay. And I can't stress that it's okay to have tough conversations with your clients. I will tell you that it made me respect my collection agencies 10 times more when they came to me as professionals. Okay, we're having, we have a concern about this, and then we solve the problem together. So don't think that you are powerless. Those conversations are really important for the longevity of your relationship, or to determine whether or not you even want to work with that client. You might determine you don't, that client is causing you more risk than reward. So.
Mhm.
We've got a few minutes left, and I feel like I'm under, sort of a legal obligation these days to talk about Hunstein in every webinar I do. So let's throw it out there. Obviously that's thrown a lot of collection agencies for a loop, wondering what they can and should be doing. And I'm wondering, how would you sort of recommend factoring, not just the ruling, but the uncertainty kind of going forward until we have some finality to this case, impacting, compliance audits and sort of that whole aspect of the process.
Sarah, you're in the line of fire on that one. You want to go first? So nice.
So I don't know that you need to necessarily change any audit processes due to Hunstein quite yet. What I do think is that you need to assess your risk, right, in the 11th Circuit and probably talk to your outside counsel. I think you also need to keep a very close eye on trends. We know that, copycat lawsuits are happening across the country right now. Are you getting complaints that are using certain words that are talking about a letter vendor suddenly? Should that heighten your awareness? Should you do anything proactive? I want to be careful not to make any suggestion of what I think you should do, because there's no clear-cut answer for that right now. That's something I think that you do have to determine with your legal counsel. But it might be as part of your monitoring and auditing controls. You probably want to watch those trends and keep your executive management team abreast of any changes in those trends in light of the Hunstein case.
I guess I would say, since Hunstein, it's venued in the 11th Circuit, so Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. I mean, I bet no one could fault me if I said, if you send letters into those states, the most conservative thing you would do is to not send the information to a third-party letter vendor at this point. That would be the most conservative thing to do, and to, in fact, print letters yourself or use a different communication strategy, because we will not know if the full 12 judge panel of the 11th Circuit is going to grant the en banc rehearing. We do not know that yet. We do know that as of Friday, I believe, Rick Purr, the attorney representing the defendant, did obtain a verbal extension, not that it's less than effective, but a verbal extension for the defendant to file a petition for a rehearing to May 25th, which gives all of us who are parts of coalitions the opportunity to file our briefs within 7 days of the defendant in that case files their petition for a rehearing. It could take, like Sarah said, there are all these copycat cases. It could take 36 months before we see how other circuits are going to decide this issue. And I also know one thing that I'm excited about is that never before in all my experience, I've never seen the defense bar and the trade associations so aligned on an issue such that I almost wish a consumer lawyer might be on this, because we are pouring money into in a very good way, because this is a showstopper. You know what I mean? This is absurdity to the nth degree, actually, in terms of how it plays out, particularly when you have a CFPB that has 2 guidance documents on service provider management. You know what I mean? So it's just almost, but the fact is, 3-judge panel did make the decision that the sharing of that information was an unauthorized disclosure of the debt without the consent of the consumer, and therefore we are in this situation. So I'm not going to tell you to do anything other than what I just said is the most conservative thing, but I would strongly recommend seeking the advice of legal counsel to see if you can, with guidance, tolerate something a little bit less stringent than that. I don't know. Vaishali, anything?
Yeah, no, just echoing that. I think a lot of my clients are asking me this question: what should we do? Should we make an overhaul? How do we do that? I'm saying let's just wait on at least to the to understand whether the en banc hearing, goes forward, and at least that gives you a little space of time. If there's going to be a full, if this is going to be an issue that has to be appealed on a different case, then I may have a different recommendation. But I would say right now, definitely stay in touch with, like Roseanne said, me and others at my firm are involved in a lot of coalitions in terms of figuring out a defense strategy, figuring out legal argument, brainstorming, and I'm not going to put them all here, but because it wouldn't be appropriate. But I think stay in touch with folks who are in the know, not just us. There are many other firms who are having those conversations, because I think that's the best way to make a intelligent, informed decision rather than just guessing. And stay tuned a little bit and have a little patience, because legal processes take a long time.
Yeah, and the only thing, I want to add one quick thing to what they both just said. If you take Roseanne's most conservative approach and you determine that you have just a way too much value in the 11th district, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, to take the risk of using your letter vendor, and you start printing mail in your in-house, great. Guess what you need to build? An audit process. You need a very serious quality control and audit process around that to make sure that you're not causing additional issues by sending them in-house. You're not double stuffing envelopes. There's a whole bunch. There's reasons we use letter vendors. So just think about that. Okay.
Right.
So, all right.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. So we have to wrap things up. But Vaishali, Sarah, Roseanne, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your time and your expertise and your wisdom with our audience. On behalf of everybody who watched and listened and is walking away definitely smarter because of their participation today. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody who watched and listened. Thanks to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. There's a link in the chat window. It'll also pop up on your screen to share your feedback on today's event and any other ideas. There's definitely a webinar on privilege coming. I've already got people reaching out with emails with offers and ideas. So the ball's moving on that one. So look for that one in June. We've got other webinars. Tomorrow we're talking the TCPA post Facebook. Wednesday we're talking FDCPA litigation. Thursday we're talking about where to find people and hire people. And Friday we're talking about charitable giving. So
don't worry about a compliance audit, for heaven's sakes.
If you haven't signed up for those, you'll find the link in the events calendar on accountsrecovery.net for all of those. So look forward to seeing you back. Until then, everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.